What's up, YouTube? We're in day one of post bannings. We played this league in day one of post bannings. If you caught us live at twitch.tv/the_CntrlFreak, then you saw the league play out live. The VOD is over on the Twitch channel. You can find a link to it down below in the description, as well as the Discord if you want to come say hey. The Twitch, the Discord, the Twitter, in case you want to know when a stream's going live, and the deck list. But played through some DIMIR Shadow. Obviously, we got to see how DIMIR Shadow fares without Fury now that it's banned. I don't know if our deck can adapt with such a heavy loss, but you know, you got to adapt, you got to overcome. Here we are, Furyless again, forever. But we're going through some of the matchups now. Kind of curious to see what Modern's going to look like now that Fury's gone, Up the Beanstalk's gone. If we see a rise in the aggressive creature decks, then DIMIR's got a little ways to go. It's going to have to do some adapting. Going to have to incorporate some more removal heavy game plan to deal with some of those early threats. If we see more unfair stuff, back to Rhinos, back to Living In, then I think DIMIR has a very solid chance of making a name for itself. If we see more one ring decks, DIMIR's pretty solid. If we see more Urza Saga, then we might have to throw some more Spreading Seas, Dress Down, something in there. But at the moment, we just got the shakeup. We don't know where things are going to fall, so we're still in the testing phase, still like the wait it out, see what happens before we start trying to make any extreme changes. So we're just kind of going pretty much stock. Went up to the 4th Fatal Push over the Bitter Reunions, or Bitter Triumphs. Now that there's no Furies or Griefs to deal with on turn 1, the Bitter Triumph's a little less necessary. The 4 Fatal Push kind of respecting things like Yawgmoth that I think will be popping up a little bit more. Hardened Scales. Just some extra removal in the main that doesn't cause us to ditch cards or ditch life. Got Dismembers, couple Tishana's Tidebinders, went up on Dress Downs. Again, nod to Yawgmoth, Hardened Scales if we're expecting some more of those in the meta. Sideboard, 3 copies of Dalthy Voidwalkers, one I'm really interested in trying out. Couple Stub, couple Stern Scolding, a Flusterstorm Dress Down, 2 Spreading Seas, 2 Engineered Explosives, and 2 Cursed Totems. So let's go ahead and jump in and showcase some of the games here. Maybe DIMIR's an option you're thinking about picking up. So if we get to see some of the decks we expect to be more popular, then we can start kind of forming a new game plan for those. Round number 1, on the play. Love to be on the play in Modern. I would highly recommend it. Makes things worlds easier. On the play with the Thoughtseize, even better. So up against Domain Zoo right off the bat. Scion of Draco, Leyline Bindings. Scion is a card that we have a pretty tough time dealing with, so getting to counterspell this first one, very nice. That being said, they have Leyline Binding and then a bunch of red-based removal. So if we can deal with the bindings with like some of our counter spells, a lot of times the red removal isn't good enough to get Shadows or mURktides off the board. As long as we can get a bit of a board presence down. So here we could have considered for a land. I really don't want to take more life loss. So while my opponent's just got 1 extra Leyline Binding in hand, we'll just get a couple threats down so we can start applying some amount of pressure. Get a Kavu. Pretty okay with me. We top deck this Bowmaster so we can attack into the Kavu. If they block, then we can just Bowmaster ping ourselves while we know their last card's a Stubborn Denial. If they didn't block, then I could either play out the Bowmaster's chump blockers or play out the other Shadow and plan on trading. Follow up with a Nahiri, the Nahiri, the unsomething, reanimates dudes. It kind of got a little bit of popularity in Stoneblade list as soon as it came out. Hadn't really had an impact on Modern, but either way, they get back a Kavu, swing into a token. We say, cool, we're going to chump block. Thankfully, it doesn't give Kavu trample or anything crazy like that. So, I don't really know the purpose of the Nahiris. There might be like a Stoneblade sub-theme in their deck somewhere, or they might just use it as a sort of value engine. either way, sideboarding against the zoo deck, I'm kind of taking out some of my life loss engines, some thought seizes. Bowmaster is not the most impactful. Boarding in like spreading seas, maybe engineered explosives, stern scolding if I expect them to be on the more aggressive side with like 4 Ragavan, 4 Wild Nicotl, dress down, really great at killing territorial Kavu, taking flying off of Scion of Draco, pumping Shadow without needing to lose all the life. But you kind of have to treat it like, or treat the matchup a little bit like prowess, where a little life loss is okay, but you don't want to get too aggressive and have your opponent just like flames bolt you out from nowhere. So just be conscientious that is something that can occur if you get too greedy. So trying to hold up this Misty as long as I can, mainly because I don't want to lose the life if I don't have to. Again, I don't want to put myself dead to just like bolt, flames or something. I know I have a stub, but I'll probably have to stub like a Leyline Binding or a way to answer my mURktide. Opponent Tidebinder's here. I will say I made a mistake right here. My opponent put this Territorial Kavu on the stack. I should have responded with Dress Down. So if they had a Stubborn Denial, they wouldn't be able to counter my Dress Down and force my Stubborn Denial. So if I just drop the Dress Down, it kills the Kavu before it enters the battlefield, or like when it enters, and I would be able to just effectively make sure I kill it without having to waste another spell. But I got a little bailed out because I waited, went for the Bowmaster. My opponent went for Tidebinder, and I got to dress down the Tidebinder, which means I killed the Kavu, still got my Bowmaster trigger, stopped the Tidebinder from entering, and then I just have lethal with a Dismember on the Tidebinder on the way back. But just remember that against like Zoo, they have Stubborn Denial, so dress down in response to the Kavu. Pretty good little line. Either way, on to match number 2. We keep a 1-lander with a Preordain and a Consider on the play, so optimistic that we'll find our land. Looks like we're up against another Zoo opponent. Really wish we could have found a land, because that Bowmaster into Wild Nicotl would have been pretty nice. But we don't. It looks like they're representing Stubborn Denial. So, a little surprised that they didn't stub that Preordain there. But maybe there's a chance they don't have stub. We can't really afford to play around it very much. We also don't have a way of getting the Scion off the board except for blocking. So if the opponent can answer our mURktide like this, we're pretty far behind. Then second Scion kind of seals the deal, especially if they have a Stubborn Denial too. But even without the stub, we're just kind of too far behind. Scion of Draco is a card that DIMIR has a really tough time answering. Your options are kind of something like Hurkyl's Recall, which you don't really want to bring in against Zoo. Dismember, Bitter Triumph, Shieldred's Edict, a bigger mURktide. Your mURktide bigger than a 4/4, or like a Shadow plus a Dress Down. So opponent gets a Rest in Peace. Pretty okay with that. We did keep like all of our mURktides and Drowning the Locks in for this game. And I believe I ended up boarding out like all the Drowns and one of the mURktides going into game 3. Spoiler alert, we win this one. There's a game 3. So, you know. Sorry. Got Bowmaster pinging us down. Opponent's got some lands. They've got a Giganta in hand. Or not in hand, but in the companion zone. Thought they might Bowmaster our Bowmaster, which would be okay with me because I just Fatal Push the token after Bowmaster resolves. We get to keep one of our things alive. Scion. Kavu is fine. We'll just go ahead and Fatal Push the Kavu. I could wait till my turn and Dress Down, but I want to resolve Shadow and then hold up Dress Down or Counter Spell. So if my opponent goes for like a removal spell, I've got counter. If they attack in, I can Dress Down, block the Scion. But since they go for removal and nothing else, we get to crack back. They don't block. And we Dress Down for a lethal Shadow on the game 3. Match 2, game 3. So, like I said, when I saw Rest in Peace, I boarded out some Drowns, boarded out a mURktide. They are really good cards, but if my opponent's just shutting off the graveyard, I don't want to be super reliant on that. So here, when they have turn 2 Rest in Peace, I kind of know, like, awesome. Not really that concerned about it. Pass with Bowmaster up. The Showa Brawler's good. I Fatal Push that Brawler. I should have Bowmastered, pinged them, untapped, Fatal Push, and like consider for a counter spell or something. But I think I was a little afraid that I wouldn't draw land and I wouldn't be able to hold up counter spell and kill the Showa Brawler. But I probably should have just played the odds and said, like, hey, I'm getting 3 looks at a land, or 4 if I preordain. Surely I'll find one. So tank a Tribal Flames to the face. We know opponent's got Stub, Chain to the Rocks, Ragavan. mURktide's pretty dead. Play out the Shadow, so if they Chain to the Rocks this, I get to EE, knock out Chain to the Rocks, and maybe knock out Ragavan as well, depending on if they decide to play it out. So they have a Soft Stubborn Denial available. I do not want to go down to 5 if I can avoid it, because that's Tribal Flames territory. So if I wanted to like hold up Counter Spell, I'd have to EE, not crack it, hold up Counter Spell. So when I drew the Shadow, I kind of decided, like, I'll just be more proactive and get the threat down instead of worrying about the EE right now. Opponent's not advancing their board at all, so we'll take the opportunity to take their board from them. Now, I could have fetched again, and presented lethal with Shadow plus Bowmaster. Would have had the counter spell for the Leyline Binding, and could have paid for the Soft Stub. I kind of decided that was too aggressive, since I still had the EE to maybe blow up the Chain to the Rocks if I need to. So played a little more passively. I don't know what their last card is outside of the Stub, so I don't really know if I got rewarded for it or not. But if it was like a Lightning Bolt, then I played around it by not forcing myself to fetch at any point. So I'm going to say it was a Lightning Bolt and feel better about myself. On to match number 3. Looks like Blue-Red mURktide. You can tell by the fact that they play Blue-Red lands and no companion. So that's all I got. That's as good an identifier as I can give you. Ledger Shredder, pretty good follow-up. We could go for getting down to Bowmaster. Pretty good chance they have removal, just like we saw here. Should bring up their hand momentarily. There we go. So I knew they had to Spell Pierce. Didn't want to like fire off removal spell into the Spell Pierce. I was hoping that they would pierce the Consider on their upkeep and then go for like a Bolt Me or something, so I could make sure I resolved Drown in the Lock on the Shredder. But opponent did a reasonable job of being pretty passive, so now we just have to like slow things down a bit. They're going to go for Bolt Us. I'm going to let that resolve my Drown in the Lock so I can pay for Spell Pierce. We only attacked with the Bowmaster so that if they top decked a Ragavan, they wouldn't be able to dash it back at us. You know, normal stuff. Play Shadow, they counter. I could try to counter back, but I know they have the Spell Pierce, so Doesn't make a lot of sense to fight over that. And then much like against Zoo, not wanting to go down to 5. Against mURktide, I really don't want to go down to 3 if I can avoid it. Helps me dodge Lightning Bolt a little bit. That being said, drawing all these Thoughtseize is not really helping the not go down to 3 thing. Big ol' mURktide here. Got a counter. We can pay for Spell Pierce. Thankfully, they don't have a Spell Snare. And then rip Shadow off the top. So decent chance this will be good enough to get us there. Unless you're like playing an opponent that's running Archmage's Charm in 23. I'm guessing with Archmage's Charm, Brazen Borrower, that they're kind of thinking, okay, Scam's gone. I can play a longer mid-rangey game. So Ledger Shredder, Archmage's Charm, Brazen Borrower, cards that would historically be pretty rough into Bowmaster, especially a combination of all 3. But I'm guessing opponent, like I said, trying them out because there's no Fury. There's likely not much Scam. If there's not much Scam, there's not as much Bowmaster. Though Bowmaster's still very, very prevalent in the meta. So don't think that just because Scam is gone that you don't have to worry about Bowmasters and X1s and drawing cards. It's still a thing. Could go for the Thoughtseize. I don't really see much of a point in firing it off into what's very likely a Spell Pierce. So I can just like wait until my next turn, fire off Thoughtseize, pay for Pierce if I need to. See, a handful of red removal. So this Dolthy is not very long for this world. I was really hoping to eat a Heat or a Bolt with that Dolthy. So it did catch a Stern Scolding into the second one, catching a top deck Spell Snare. But I wanted to work through like the Unholy Heats and the Bolts so that maybe mURktide plus Counterspell could live. But right now, if I go for the mURktide, it's a 5/5. So I'd have to counter the Unholy Heat, and they could still just kill it with double Bolt. It'll push the Channeler, catch Counterspell, which is great, because now I know their hand is double Lightning Bolt Unholy Heat. So if I can just find like a little more interaction to protect my dudes, which I could have gone for Shadow there. Honestly, yeah, I should have played out the Shadow into the double Bolt Heat, because if they go for any one removal spell, I counterspell. So if they go for like Lightning Bolt, I counterspell. They untap, bolt it again. Or, yeah, bolt it again. Then I untap and mURktide outgrows the Heat. So I know mURktide's going to live unless they've drawn, like, more red removal. Or best case scenario is they go for Heat on the Shadow. I counterspell, then they bolt, and I untap, have mURktide, and it's nowhere near boltable at that point. So opponent's going to counter or Unholy Heat my Shadow, go to Counterspell. I thought maybe I could bait them into using one of the bolts here on the Shadow, but they end up not going for it. So we're just going to Flusterstorm the Heat, pass the turn. We know they've got 2 Lightning Bolts. Pretty good chance they're going to try to like save those, maybe try to hit a third. It's usually the case with people that run bolt heavy decks against Shadow. They really try to like sandbag bolts, which sometimes works, but more often than not, it ends up like bolts sitting around in hand, not doing anything. So absolutely thrilled when they decided to double bolt the mURktide. We intentionally played a small mURktide first. One, because I could have gone ahead and cast the second mURktide to outgrow the bolts if I wanted to. But more, I just wanted them to like spin the bolts on something, and then I'd have a bigger dragon next. I also got a little greedy here. My opponent had one card in hand, top decked a Preordain, and I let him resolve the Preordain into an expressive iteration and then resolve that. Because I was like, oh, they're using up all their mana. They need to get both my dudes off the board. I should have just like counterspelled the expressive iteration and said, all right, you got one card. Is it good enough to win? But like I said, I got greedy. I don't know if I mentioned sideboarding against mURktide, but kind of like Zoo, you're trimming on like Thought Seizes because you don't want to get into a Lightning Bolt war. I might trim on Drown in the Lock because of mURktide, but usually I'm not going to like overly trim on them because they're still good against everything else. Sorry if you can hear me chewing. But kind of the game plan against mURktide is get to a life total where Shadow doesn't die to Bolt, but you're not so low that you die to like double Bolt. Don't let your mURktide get countered. Counter their mURktide. And try to keep as much information as you can for as long as you can, because if you don't have information, you're going to have a tough time like knowing what to play around. So if you want to keep in like all 4 Thought Seizes, I'm not against it. It makes playing around like the hand a lot easier. But, oh man. But a lot of the times, like with how many cards they draw and see off Preordain, Consider, Expressive Iteration, that point can be kind of moot a lot of the time. Because if you know what's in their hand this turn, but 2 turns later it's completely different, didn't do you much good. We got a little double Bolt attempt on my upkeep. Fine by me. I do not want to go down to 3. Like, I know I've got counter spells and I could afford to go down to 3. But if I do, it means if they've got the 3rd Bolt, I can just never tap off of counterspell again. But if I counter a Bolt, then I feel a lot safer because now they need 2 bolts in 38 cards. They'd have to have seen all 4 lightning bolts to bolt me out. Finally find a mURktide. I know one of their cards is dead, so I want to try to jam this mURktide while I can. Got Subtlety, Counterspell. We've got Counterspell, so now the hope is they don't have like Heat plus another red spell as their last unknowns. Also hoping they're not following the former legal modern format in playing Fury. But never know. You don't want to assume. Go ahead and get some value out of our Dismember there. I've got Otawara if they resolve a mURktide, so I don't really feel like I need to hold up Dismember for mURktide. This was a pretty fun stack. So opponent did have the 3rd Lightning Bolt. They went for Petty Theft to bounce my mURktide. I responded with Stub the Petty Theft because, hey, I don't want you to have a Petty Theft or a Brazen Borrower. So they go Unholy Heat, target my mURktide with Lightning Bolt. We get to Otawara bounce our own mURktide, which not only saves the mURktide to recast later, but also stifles the Petty Theft. Now, they get no Brazen Borrower. I know their last card in hand is Stern Scolding. They play out a land. I have dressed down for lethal here, but I second-guessed myself and thought, well, like, what if I didn't keep up with their hand correctly? What if the Stern Scolding was something that I saw somewhere, completely forgot that I don't even run Bauble, so there is nothing that would have given me that information outside of Thoughtseize. So I played out the mURktide and held up the dress down and then was like, oh, wait. Yeah, I just had lethal. Either way, on to match number 4. Nice little one lander on the draw, but we do have consider, so reasonable chance of finding a second land. Put it on Polluted Delta for Steam Vents Preordained with a Water Grave, so probably like Grixis control. I've seen a lot of Grixis control recently with like Flame of Anor, Snapcaster, Shieldred, the One Ring. So I think that's kind of like the blue, black, X control deck of choice at the moment. We posted another video a couple days ago where I was playing Yawgmoth for the first time ever and ran into this Grixis control deck. And when I say like I stumbled like nobody's business and they had all the hate and it just didn't matter, I mean it. Like they had turn 1 Stone of Eric. They had a, what's it called? The thing that shuts off activated abilities that I'm running. Curse Totem. They had the removal. We missed land drops and still just like won handily. This was an interaction I learned this game. Flame of Anor. So if you know modal spells like Kolaghan's Command, things like that, they have all of the abilities listed or all the options listed, and I'll bring it up here in a second. There you go. They have the abilities or the options listed. The spell resolves in the order of the options that you pick. So if you pick like draw 2 cards and then deal 5 damage, it resolves in that order. So Bowmaster sees your opponent drawing those 2 cards, even though the spell resolves at once. So they don't get to kill the Bowmaster and then get their 2 cards. No, they draw the 2 first. The Bowmaster trigger doesn't go on the stack until after the full spell is resolved, but it still sees that happen before the lethal damage is dealt to the Bowmaster. So keep that in mind whenever modal spells get played against you, that there is an order of operations there, and you want to make sure you know what's happening in what order. Cycle through this dress down just to try to get something going on. Thoughtseize, see Bowmaster push Bolt. So we've got Tidebinder against their multiple removal spells. Another Bowmaster off the top, really, really good for us. So now we can like Bowmaster, counter their Bowmaster, force them to use some removal spells or a removal spell. Yeah, they bolt my Bowmaster. I counter their Bowmaster. I get a token. They get to resolve a preordain. Decide to put the Misty on top, the counterspell below that, because I would like to find more counterspells between Shieldred, maybe mURktide, the One Ring. They got a lot of good top decks. But the bright side is my opponent seems to refuse to use Fatal Push on this Orc Army token. No way am I letting a Flame of Anor resolve at this point of the game. So really having to kind of like hope my opponent whiffs on a top deck this turn, so we can get this army moving a little faster. Top deck Fatal Push is nice, but at the end of the day, like I need my opponent to Fatal Push this army token so I can get Tidebinder down and get the last points with that. Then I should play the Shadow here realistically, but at this point it was like a matter of principle. Like I'm making you Fatal Push this token. I'm not giving you the satisfaction of Fatal Pushing my Shadow. So I get the Thoughtseize away, Shieldred's Edict. They have one unknown top deck. Turns out their unknown top deck is an Otawara, and we get to Tidebinder the Otawara trigger and attacking for lethal. Nice. Just how we drew it up. Game 2. Not much to say about game 2. Our opponent saw a pretty rough start. Steam Vents, as we show on this Thoughtseize here. Steam Vents, Basic Island, and I don't think I even zoom out of their hand because they just never see a third land and end up scooping in a couple turns. I know you don't want me spoiling the ending for you, but I did get a huge laugh here. I know they've got a Stern Scolding, so at the end of the turn when I tapped a Watery Grave and an island to cast a Dress Down, I'm sure they thought it was a Bowmaster and went to like snap off that Stern Scolding, and it didn't hit. So here I just like decide, all right, I'm going to play out my 5/5 mURktide. You can't counter it. You don't have black mana for an edict or anything. I've got counter spells. Let's do this. And opponent scooped it up. So we're on to match number 5. Playing for the trophy against the Meat Man, also streaming on Twitch. We rated them right after this match. Whether that tells you it was good or bad, I don't know. So up against Yawgmoth for the trophy. Really glad to run into Yawgmoth this soon in the season, because at least that means, yeah, people are playing it. Don't know if it's good or not yet, or good like meta call, but it is a really good deck against us, and that's about all that matters, especially if we stumble here and don't find our third land right away. So we do get to counter Grixis. Always love that. We know they've got a Verdant Catacombs, a Zulaport Cutthroat, and an Unknown. They did play out that Peat land. We could just jam a Shadow, but we're getting to the point of the game where they've got so many like live top decks that I'm a little hesitant to just throw out a Shadow and tap off of Counterspell. I can kind of afford to wait another turn or two to make sure I get down Shadow with counter backup. So Cord here. They got a Zulaport, 2 Unknowns in hand. So as soon as they untap with a Halfling and make uncounterable black mana for legendaries, you know what's happening. Here's the Yawgmoth. We do have to counter the Young Wolf so they can't loop and kill our Shadow. Not the most exciting play in the world, but gotta do what you gotta do. Thankfully, Yawgmoth does have to have a relatively high life total to keep things rolling. So picking off a couple cheap creatures is nice. But at the same time, they can just overwhelm you pretty easily, especially game 1 like this. So play out the mURktide. I know I'm dead on board, but I play out the mURktide in case my opponent decides not to attack. Maybe they're afraid of another Fatal Push on a Young Wolf, because that would end up killing them, or potentially killing them. But they decide to attack anyway. Call our bluff. We go to game 2. Sideboarding against Yawgmoth. We do have 3 Dolphy, 2 Cursed Totems that we're bringing in, then 2 Stern Scoldings. So I've got a reasonable amount of things that are historically good against Yawgmoth. Go ahead and consider. We held up Stern Scolding in case they had a Halfling on turn 1. Then I thought about ditching the Steam Vents because it doesn't actually get me closer to Dolphy, but decided to keep it. Drew the Watery Grave anyway. It Legion's End our Dolphy, so we immediately draw another Dolphy. You know, like Thoughtseize bug, but Legion's End. And then I think this game is such a phenomenal example of how resilient Yawgmoth is. How well this deck fights through hate. So we had a Stern Scolding for the Halfling. They Legions ended our first Dolphy. Got another Dolphy, feeling good. They find a Yawgmoth after a Bowmaster. So they have the triggers to kill off the Dolphy, but we have Tidebinder to stop them and shut down the Yawgmoth. So we've had Dolphy on board, second Dolphy, Tidebinder down the Yawgmoth. Pretty reasonable start for the Dimir deck, if I do say so myself. I get down a Shadow, so we've got a block of a Yawgmoth. They grist away the Bowmaster, kill the Tidebinder, so now Yawgmoth is unlocked, plus the Young Wolf. Okay, things getting a little sketchy. Find another copy of Dolphy. So 3 Dolphys so far. Kill off the Grist. We want to make sure that their stuff's getting exiled so that Soul Cauldron doesn't get worse for us. Really heads up play by my opponent here to put a counter on both of my Dolphys and then proliferate to get rid of both of them. And then follow it up with a Bitter Triumph on my mURktide. So they've killed all 3 Dolphys plus a mURktide. We've got double Shadow down. They've got 1 card in hand. It's an Endurance. So I know they're going to be able to sack away the Endurance and draw another card. We can grow the Shadow by 1 currently. I did make a sequencing mistake here. I drew a fetch land, or I drew Consider, bottom to mURktide because I couldn't play it. Drew a fetch land. I should have fetched and shocked the fetch land before I cracked the Fiery Islet. And it actually ended up punishing me pretty hard because my opponent sacks the Endurance, draws into a Bowmaster, which is just the best draw they could possibly find. 2 bodies, instant speed, allows them to shrink one of my Shadows below lethal range. Hagra Mauling, which I've never seen before in my life. It's one of the flip cards from Zendikar, the new Zendikar, that destroys a creature, but you can pay 1 less if they have no basic lands. So I have no basic lands, cost 3, whatever. Kills one of my Shadows. That's the important part. I do get to force a Yawgmoth into chump mode here, but I just want to point out, killed all 3 Dolphys, killed a mURktide, killed a Shadow, Enduranced me. Yawgmoth drew like 3 or 4 cards. Bowmaster token, Endurance, Young Wolf, at least 4 cards. And that was after I had like every piece of hate I could muster up outside of Curse Totem. So here we are on the draw game 3. Have to kill the Halfling because I can't deal with the turn 2 uncounterable Grist. We do find another land so we can hold up Dismember, but obviously it's not a black land, so I can't Dolphy just yet. There's a black land, so now I can Dolphy. Just kind of hope that our opponent doesn't have anything too relevant. Bowmaster, put a counter on the Bowmaster. I probably should have just dismembered the Bowmaster right here. Or not on their turn, but on my turn. They still would have gotten this Grist down. They still would have been able to sack something and kill the Dolphy. So it wouldn't have saved the Dolphy by any means. We would have ended up in the same spot. But there's a chance maybe they would have had 1 less play to make if I had. Either way, we did kind of get aggroed out, so we decided to just throw our hand on the board. Like, you've killed my Dolphy, you've got a Soul Cauldron with the Walrus, you got a Grist. Please don't have anything too crazy. You got another Bitter Triumph for mURktide. Dang. So now I've got, like, nothing going on. I can't attack the Grist or I'm dead on the crackback to the guys. Top deck a Cutthroat. Rough. Like, I really believe Curse Totem on turn 2 is about the only thing that Dimir can do against Yawgmoth. I know Yawgmoth already has a good matchup against control decks, but wow, does it feel bad. That might actually be a reason. If Yawgmoth picks up this much, that might actually be a reason to go like Ledger Shredder to try to get more mid-rangey flying threats in the deck. Maybe Subtlety, Ledger Shredder, something like that. Yawgmoth could be the thing that pushes me that far. As far as the deck goes, only changes I'm really interested in are probably cutting the steam vents or like an underground river. Man, I wish we had a blue-black canopy land. I would be so thrilled if I could replace steam vents and fiery islet with blue-black canopy lands. But unfortunately, we do not have that. Might have to run swamp if Dolphy is in your sideboard. But with less scam around, that's probably an okay concession. Otherwise, rest of the deck felt really fantastic. We did get a little light on lands a few times. I did miss Street Wraith being a free cantrip to look for lands early. But I don't think it's a consideration that's like crucial enough to make me hate one way or the other, like one way or the other more. But I probably wouldn't mind finding room for the 19th land. I did feel like there were several times I was land light. The problem being we don't really have a good way to like filter through those lands when we do get flooded and find more stuff. So still looking for a card advantage engine if you find something that's working well for you. Sideboard, pretty happy with. Might try to find room to try out the 4th Dolphy, but not until I up the number of black sources that I've got access to. But that's it for this video. Hope everybody enjoyed it. If you give DIMIR a try, give me a shout. Let me know in the comments. Let me know what's working for you. Otherwise, hope you all have a fantastic rest of your day. Stay safe. Enjoy some good food and company. I will catch y'all back live later. Adios for now.